In October 1944, U.S. Navy operational planners assessed the survival probability of USS Tang, Belau-class submarine SS-306, as marginal. The calculation was procedural, not speculative. Tang's patrol patterns showed sustained surface exposure at night, repeated reentry into defended convoy geometries, and engagement tempos that exceeded the recovery assumptions built into Japanese escort doctrine. The governing constraint was time. Specifically, the interval between visual detection and coordinated escort response, measured in minutes, versus Tang's attack cycle, compressed into windows of seconds. USS Tang entered her fifth war patrol with 6 forward and 4 aft 21-inch torpedo tubes, carrying a mixed load dominated by Mark 18 electric torpedoes. Each Mark 18 ran at approximately 29 knots with no visible wake, eliminating the primary post-launch detection cue used by escort lookouts. Reload time inside the pressure hull averaged 8 to 10 minutes per tube under stable conditions. This reload cycle was non-negotiable. It defined the maximum sustainable rate of fire and imposed a fixed rhythm on Tang's operations from the first contact onward. Japanese convoy escort doctrine in late 1944 relied on layered deterrence rather than interception. Escorts were spaced between 1,500 and 2,000 meters, forming overlapping visual sectors supported by basic sonar and manual plotting. The system assumed that a surface submarine would disengage immediately after firing, increasing range to avoid gunfire. That assumption was embedded in response procedures, turn rates, and command signaling. Tang's tactics violated it systematically. On initial contact, Tang surfaced inside the convoy perimeter, identified targets visually, and fired at ranges under 3,000 yards. From first sighting to torpedo launch, the elapsed time was often less than 60 seconds. Escort reaction required longer. Visual reports had to be confirmed, relayed by voice, and translated into maneuver orders. Under night conditions, this process consumed several minutes. Tang exploited that delay. Instead of extending range after firing, she altered bearing laterally, remaining inside the convoy's defensive envelope while escorts maneuvered toward obsolete firing points. The technical anchor governing this phase was geometry. Convoy defense depended on predictable arcs and mutual coverage. Tang's lateral repositioning broke those arcs. Each escort maneuver created temporary gaps elsewhere in the formation. Because escorts acted sequentially rather than simultaneously, the defensive system responded to Tang's past position, not her current one. The error margin, measured in hundreds of yards, was sufficient for Tang to re-engage before the system could reset. Inside the submarine, internal limits accumulated steadily. Battery draw increased during repeated high-speed surface runs, reducing submerged endurance margins. Crew fatigue rose as reload cycles repeated without rest intervals. Handling times lengthened by seconds, then minutes. Air quality degraded as ventilation was minimized to reduce detection risk. None of these factors caused immediate failure. Together, they narrowed Tang's margin for disengagement. Japanese escorts adapted by tightening formation spacing in an attempt to reduce gaps. That adjustment introduced a new constraint. Reduced spacing limited maneuver freedom and increased coordination complexity. Turn execution times increased. Visual fields overlapped, but reaction options narrowed. When one escort accelerated aggressively, others were forced to compensate to avoid collision or loss of station. Tang's continued presence amplified these effects. The defensive system became heavier without becoming faster. From U.S. Command's perspective, Tang's patrol data triggered concern because it operated outside established safety envelopes. Doctrine evaluated risk at discrete events: detection, attack, withdrawal. Tang demonstrated that risk accumulated continuously. Exposure time mattered more than exposure count. A submarine could survive multiple short exposures safely, but sustained exposure compressed decision space until a single miscalculation would be decisive. As the engagement progressed, the convoy's defensive capacity degraded faster than it could regenerate. Each ship sunk reduced escort effectiveness. Each maneuver disrupted formation coherence further. Japanese reports treated losses as isolated incidents rather than indicators of systemic failure. That misclassification delayed doctrinal adaptation. Tang treated the engagement as a continuous process. The escorts treated it as a series of separate contacts. The asymmetry persisted. The disappearance of the convoy off Formosa was not instantaneous. It unfolded over successive attack cycles, each one consuming time the escorts could not recover. Shipping schedules, already constrained by fuel shortages and limited escort availability, could not absorb the disruption. Delays multiplied. Routes were altered. Escort density increased elsewhere, thinning protection across the theater. Tang's patrol acted as an accelerant within an already stressed logistics system. The assessment that Tang would not survive was therefore not irrational. It was based on measurable constraints, reload physics, battery limits, crew endurance, and escort response models. What those models underestimated was how long Tang could remain inside the engagement envelope before those constraints converged. Tang did not ignore limits. She operated at their edge, extracting maximum effect before withdrawal became unavoidable. The convoy vanished because the defensive system collapsed first, not from a single decisive blow, but from sustained pressure applied at a tempo that exceeded its coordination capacity. Tang's tactics did not negate Japanese escort doctrine by force. They exposed its boundary conditions by operating precisely where assumptions failed. Command questioned the tactics because doctrine had not yet incorporated this mode of warfare. The patrol forced a recalibration. Undersea combat was no longer governed solely by concealment and evasion. It had become a contest of time, coordination, and finite system endurance, measured in minutes, meters, and seconds. Tang's survival during that patrol was not guaranteed. The disappearance of the convoy was not accidental. Both outcomes emerged from the same interaction of constraints. That interaction became clearer as post-patrol data were aggregated against other late 1944 convoy actions in the Luzon Strait and east of Formosa. Tang's patrol stood out not by tonnage alone, but by engagement duration per contact. Most submarine attacks in the period involved exposure windows measured in single firing events followed by withdrawal. Tang's logs showed cumulative surface presence extending beyond 40 minutes within the same convoy geometry, broken into multiple firing and repositioning cycles. The technical anchor here was cumulative exposure time, not individual detection events. Japanese escort command procedures were not designed to manage continuous contact. Each detection reset the response sequence instead of advancing it. Bearings were logged manually. Maneuvers were issued by voice. Confirmation lagged behind movement. When Tang remained inside the perimeter, the system did not escalate coherently. It repeated its first response again and again. The effect was not paralysis, but delay. And delay, multiplied over successive minutes, translated directly into lost control. Tang's ability to sustain this posture depended on precise management of internal systems. Surface speed was kept within a narrow band that balanced maneuverability against acoustic output. Excessive speed would increase machinery noise and visual wake. Insufficient speed would reduce lateral displacement between escort turns. Course changes were calculated against estimated escort turn radii, which at night and at speed imposed predictable limits measured in seconds per degree. Tang exploited those limits to stay ahead of interception without extending range. Torpedo employment further compressed the defensive loop. Mark 18 electric torpedoes removed the visual cue of a wake, forcing escorts to infer firing positions from impact timing rather than observation. That inference introduced additional uncertainty. Time between launch and detonation varied with range and target speed. Escorts maneuvered toward incorrect bearings, widening gaps elsewhere. Each successful hit distorted the defensive picture further by introducing smoke, debris, and altered ship motion. Internally, Tang's constraints converged steadily. Remaining torpedo count dropped below thresholds that allowed flexible target selection. Battery voltage declined to levels where submerged high-speed evasion would be limited to minutes. Crew fatigue affected reload precision, increasing handling time by small but significant margins. Air quality management imposed additional restrictions on submerged endurance. None of these factors forced immediate withdrawal. Together, they defined a shrinking envelope within which continued aggression remained viable. Japanese attempts to regain control intensified. Searchlights were employed to saturate sectors rather than track targets. Gunfire was directed at suspected silhouettes, increasing volume without improving discrimination. These measures raised the local threat level, but did not restore system coherence. In fact, they accelerated saturation. Increased activity reduced effective sensor performance and narrowed attention. Tang benefited from this degradation as long as she could maintain positional uncertainty. At the operational level, the engagement revealed a mismatch between escort density and escort effectiveness. Adding more units did not improve response speed. It increased coordination load. The defensive system grew heavier, slower, and more brittle. Tang's tactics exploited that brittleness by forcing repeated partial responses rather than decisive action. For U.S. submarine command, the data posed an uncomfortable question. Tang's methods were effective precisely because they consumed safety margins. The same tempo that dismantled convoy defenses also accelerated the convergence of Tang's internal limits. There was no clear inflection point visible from inside the submarine. Risk did not announce itself. It accumulated silently as options disappeared. The convoy's disappearance was therefore the visible outcome of an invisible process. Defensive recovery time exceeded attack cycle time. Coordination lag exceeded repositioning speed. Resource depletion outpaced adaptation. When these relationships inverted, collapse followed inevitably. Tang did not overwhelm the convoy with force. She denied it time. As similar patterns were observed across late 1944 patrols, doctrine began to shift incrementally. Aggressive surface tactics were no longer viewed as aberrations, but as tools with measurable boundaries. Command guidance emphasized recognition of saturation indicators rather than rigid adherence to exposure limits. Battery state, crew condition, escort behavior, and engagement duration became decision inputs rather than background variables. Tang's patrol off Formosa thus functioned as a stress test. It exposed how far a submarine could push a convoy defense system before recovery became impossible, and how close that point lay to the submarine's own failure threshold. The convoy vanished because its system failed first. Tang survived because she withdrew before her own constraints converged completely. Both outcomes were governed by the same mechanics. The significance of the episode lies not in audacity, but in measurement. It showed that undersea warfare had entered a phase where outcomes were decided by relative rates of saturation and recovery, not by singular acts of surprise. Time, not concealment, became the decisive variable. That shift toward time-dominated outcomes altered how both sides implicitly valued space, exposure, and persistence. Japanese escort doctrine had been optimized to protect shipping across distance. Tang's patrol demonstrated that distance was no longer the primary currency. Time inside the defensive envelope was. Escorts could cover miles of ocean, but they could not compress their reaction cycles below certain human and mechanical limits. Tang exploited that asymmetry relentlessly. The controlling technical anchor in this phase was cycle mismatch. Escort response cycles, detect, classify, maneuver, coordinate, operated on multi-minute intervals. Tang's attack cycle surface, acquire, fire, displace, operated on sub-minute segments. As long as Tang's cycle time remained shorter than escort recovery time, the defensive system accumulated error. Each cycle added noise faster than it could be cleared. This imbalance persisted until the convoy's internal coherence degraded beyond repair. Tang's navigation decisions were constrained by precise tolerances. Dead reckoning error accumulated at known rates, depending on speed and course change frequency. Excessive maneuvering increased positional uncertainty, which risked misalignment during firing solutions. To manage this, Tang limited course changes to calculated angles that balanced displacement against navigational drift. This was not improvisation. It was geometry applied under pressure. Escort maneuvers revealed predictable limits as well. Destroyer turn radii at night, under blackout conditions, imposed minimum execution, times measured in tens of seconds. Acceleration curves constrained how quickly escorts could reposition without losing formation integrity. Tang's lateral shifts were timed to exploit these curves. By the time an escort completed a turn, Tang had already altered bearing again, remaining inside the convoy while evading direct interception. The acoustic environment deteriorated rapidly. Machinery noise from high-speed escort maneuvers increased background levels. Explosions from sinking ships introduced transient spikes that masked quieter signatures. Sonar effectiveness declined accordingly. Escorts compensated by relying more heavily on visual cues, which at night were inherently limited. The defensive system lost redundancy. Failure in one sensor domain was no longer offset by another. Inside Tang, system management became increasingly conservative even as external pressure intensified. Battery conservation dictated surface preference despite rising threat levels. Air management limited submerged duration between engagements. Torpedo inventory dropped to levels where each remaining weapon represented a significant fraction of total offensive capability. Decision-making narrowed. Choices were framed not by opportunity, but by constraint. At this point, the engagement entered a critical regime. Tang's continued presence generated diminishing tactical returns while accelerating internal depletion. The escort system, though degraded, began to stabilize as reactions became more disciplined through repetition. Patterns were formed. Attention narrowed. The randomness Tang had exploited decreased. The advantage shifted subtly from speed to endurance. This transition underscores a key technical lesson. Saturation is reversible until it is not. Escort systems degraded under sustained load, but recovery was possible if pressure eased. Tang's success depended on denying that recovery long enough to exhaust the system's adaptive capacity. Once partial recovery began, the cost of continued aggression rose sharply. Command assessments after the patrol reflected this realization. Tang's tactics were not dismissed, but they were contextualized. They worked under specific conditions: night, limited escort training, constrained coordination, and sufficient internal reserves. Outside those conditions, the same tactics could produce catastrophic outcomes. Doctrine began to incorporate not just what could be done, but when it should stop. The Formosa convoy vanished because its defensive system crossed a point where error accumulation exceeded correction capacity. Tang withdrew because her own system approached that same threshold. The symmetry is instructive. Victory and survival were governed by identical mechanics. The difference lay in which system reached saturation first. This episode, therefore, marks a maturation point in undersea warfare. Success was no longer binary. It was conditional. It depended on understanding how fast systems degraded, how quickly they recovered, and where those curves intersected. Tang's patrol mapped that intersection with unusual clarity, not through theory, but through measured interaction under fire. The engagement involving USS Tang off Formosa in 1944 represents a point where submarine warfare ceased to be defined primarily by stealth and entered a phase governed by system interaction under sustained load. By this stage of the Pacific War, the technological gap between U.S. submarines and Japanese escort forces was already decisive. What remained unresolved was how that superiority behaved when pressed continuously rather than episodically. Historically, convoy defense doctrine assumed recovery. Detection led to response. Response led to disengagement, and disengagement created time to reset geometry, coordination, and command clarity. Tang's patrol invalidated that sequence. By remaining inside the defensive envelope and compressing attack cycles below escort reaction thresholds, she removed recovery from the equation. The result was not immediate collapse, but progressive degradation. Each minute without recovery multiplied error. Each maneuver compounded delay. Collapse became a function of time rather than firepower. In broader strategic scale, this episode aligns with a late-war transformation visible across domains. Air forces began to dominate through sortie tempo rather than individual aircraft performance. Amphibious operations succeeded by overwhelming command cycles rather than fixed defenses. Tang's patrol reflects the same logic underwater. Control shifted from space to time. Victory favored the force that could operate closer to system limits without crossing them. For U.S. submarine doctrine, the significance lay in identifying those limits. Tang demonstrated that aggressive surface tactics could dismantle convoy systems rapidly, but only within a narrow window defined by battery endurance, crew fatigue, navigation accuracy, and weapon inventory. Beyond that window, risk escalated abruptly. There was no gradual transition from success to failure. The boundary was sharp, and it was governed by converging constraints rather than enemy action alone. At the level of Japanese logistics, the disappearance of Formosa shipping underscored the fragility of late-war supply systems. Fuel shortages, limited escorts, and rigid schedules left little tolerance for sustained disruption. Tang's patrol did not create that fragility. It exposed it. The convoy vanished because the defensive system reached saturation before adaptation could occur. The outcome was structural, not incidental. In historical perspective, USS Tang's patrol is best understood as a boundary case. It mapped how far a submarine could push an opposing system before both sides approached failure thresholds. It showed that modern warfare punishes systems not when they are weak, but when they are optimized too narrowly for a threat profile that no longer applies. The enduring lesson is not about audacity or restraint. It is about measurement. When warfare becomes system-driven, outcomes are decided by relative rates: reaction versus action, recovery versus pressure, depletion versus adaptation. Tang's patrol illustrated those relationships in operational reality, measured in minutes, meters, and seconds. That is its historical scale, not a story of improbable survival or dramatic collapse, but a precise demonstration of how modern conflict is shaped when time becomes the decisive weapon and systems are driven until only one retains the capacity to recover.